guys, here come the dollies. They got fresh sinkers, hot coffee, and the sweetest smile.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. We're very happy that you're here to join us.
Hello, everyone. Good morning.
And joining us today in the Club Mobile is Dr. Katherine Landdeck, author of The Women with Silver Wings. Dr.
Which I
Kate, thank
have
you.
right here.
Yes. Dr. Kate, thank you so much for coming to speak with us and hang out with us this morning. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
I loved your book.
Well, thank you.
Just right off the cuff, I loved it. It was,
Oh, good.
I don't normally read on the bus because I'm always like, I'm going to miss my stop or whatever. And I came very close once or twice, but it was just, I loved all the stories because I loved that it was multiple WASP.
Oh,
and it was like
Yeah.
their overall history, and there was just so much information, but I don't feel like we got hit with so much information all at once.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Oh, good.
The
Good.
way
I
it read,
appreciate that. Yeah.
the way it read like a story from right from the beginning with Cornelia Fort and at Pearl Harbor, I was instantly sucked in.
hmm
And I feel like I think
Oh,
it
good.
was I think it was the first book on the WASP that both Gabby and I read. So we weren't that well researched at the beginning of reading your book.
Mhm.
So to be instantly sucked in like that and to want to be fed more and more and more, it's wonderful. We loved it. I spent most of my time annotating it so I could keep track of everyone's stories and everyone's names, and so I could Google them later on. I tried so hard not to spoil anything for myself by like going on my phone and be like, what happened to this person? What happened to this person? But yeah, it's wonderful. I spent many a late night reading it, sometimes 1 a.m. being like, put it down. Yeah, I got really sucked into
You
it.
guys are making my whole week. This is so nice. I'm so glad.
Good.
It was such a struggle to write in this style. It was such a new style for me, and so to hear that it kept you on and that you cared about these women, that really means a lot. Thank you so much.
We really did. I felt like we built somewhat of a friendship with every single one of them because you feel like you grow so close to the
Yeah.
women that you write about. What was it that attracted you to this subject in general?
It's I've studied the WASP for 30 years, which is impossible when I'm so young, of course, but
So are we, it's fine.
yeah, no, I met one. I was teaching at a flight school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I was teaching history and government. I had a bachelor's degree in history and went to an air show in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and accidentally met one of them. I had never heard of them. I met Carol Bailey Bosca, and I had never heard of them, and I couldn't believe it. I was, watched all the World War II movies with my dad and had a bachelor's in history, and I taught at a flight school. I loved airplanes. My whole life, I loved airplanes. Grew up in Omaha, so all the, Air Force planes flew over. And I met Carol, and I just couldn't believe that I'd never heard of her. And I wondered how different my life would have been if I had known that women had done that in World War II. You hear about Rosie the Riveter and nurses, but that women were actually pilots was just stunning. And Carol had given me her name and address on a little orange index card, which I still have around here someplace. And so I just started reading what I could about them, and there wasn't much out there, and that was it, and it just kind of stuck.
That's beautiful. The fact that
Yeah,
you weren't aware of them and then to be given such a gift in a person to
yeah,
meet one of them. So
yeah,
I'm assuming that a lot of the stories came from word of mouth as opposed to just families. Were a lot of them still surviving when you started your research in
yeah,
this?
yeah. So I was really lucky, compared to, works that are done more recently. I got really lucky because it was 1990, 1993 when I met Carol. And so these women were in their early 70s, and they were, they were very healthy. They were fit, they were athletic, they were going to air shows, they were doing all these events, they were having reunions, they were, cocktail hour every day kind of thing, and just a lot of fun. And I started graduate school and was trained to do oral histories. And so that's what I did is I would go to these reunions and go to these events, and I would do oral histories with the women. I did oral histories with well over 100 of them. Um, and then follow up oral histories with people like Dora and Teresa and others that I got to know much better. I could do these more in-depth oral histories. And then there were others that were doing oral histories too. Texas Woman's University is the home of their archives. They were going out and doing oral histories a little differently than I was. I kind of got their whole life story, where some other people were just doing the war years. But so those things were starting to be gathered. But yeah, you know, I had events where I have pictures of myself with 30 of the women at a time that we would all be, we would arrange multiple tables at events, 4 or 5 tables. Um, it was just very fortunate to get to know them so well personally, and then gain access to their letters and their diaries and all of those things, so I could gather their story not just from their memories of the story, but their letters that they wrote at the time and their diaries that they wrote at the time. So you can get both of those perspectives. So yeah, I was just really fortunate to have actually known the women.
For sure.
That's
We would love
incredible.
we would love to see some of the pictures you have if you're comfortable
Oh
with
yeah, yeah.
us seeing
Happy
them.
happy to share. Yeah, happy to share.
Perfect. Lovely.
Yeah.
I get the impression, and I think I got this impression way back when we spoke to Josie Pitts's daughter,
Yeah.
that these women were fearless through the rest of their lives. They
Yeah.
remained just fun and wanting to seek out adventure through their entire lives. She had mentioned that her mom went to Antarctica 3 times to visit the penguins in her later life. And
Yeah.
I said, they really just, nothing scared them.
Yeah.
They really were gung ho from the very start.
Yeah.
Nothing shied away from, they didn't shy away from anything, rather.
Yeah, yes. So this is a very distinct personality
Mhm.
that is going to apply for this program, right? I mean, they've grown up in this golden age of aviation of the 1930s, right? Several of them told me stories of Charles Lindbergh, right? In 1927, he flies across the Atlantic, and then he did a tour of the country up and had parades. A woman talked about in Tulsa, her dad took her to see Charles Lindbergh in the parade that they had. So they grew up with Amelia Earhart, one of the women who was at Pearl Harbor. Betty was there when Amelia Earhart took off for her, Hawaii to Oakland flight. And they were immersed in it and they were passionate about it, just as so much of the country was. But then they had that extra bit of personality that they were stubborn, right? That's one of the primary characteristic traits
Mhm.
of these women. They were very
Absolutely.
stubborn, but they were very intelligent. Um, and they just didn't take no for an answer whenever they could, right? I mean, they pushed and pushed to get what they wanted. And then you bring, that group of women together, this opportunity comes up. 25,000 women applied for these programs, and only 1,830 got even into the training. So you think about women of that generation, and we have these ideas about them, but 25,000 wanted to be in this program, and we only end up with 1,102 that walk around with their wings, but that suggests the personality of that whole generation is maybe a little different than we think. But yeah, these women were, so many of them were athletes, right? They played tennis, they played golf, they snow skied. Teresa James, won ice skating competitions. They just they were a special breed of woman, that's for sure.
They really were. And I feel like in some ways, that was reflected in both of their leaders, both in Jackie and in
Mm-hmm.
Nancy. We would love to ask you about their relationship.
Yeah.
I feel like your book is one of the only ones that sort of delves into the fact that it was more on a rivalry side as opposed to a respected friendship. What were your first thoughts when you read about those two together? Was it sort of oh, they respected each other, or was it instantly these women did not get along?
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting because that's a piece that amongst the WASP, the women themselves got brought up a lot. You were either for Nancy or for Jackie, right? Kind of thing. And I talked to Mary Lou Neal, one of the women who knew them both very well. She knew them both before the war. She sat me down and she's like, Katie, you've got to talk about these women, and it's not just a rivalry. It's not just women who can't get along. Don't say that. Don't say that. And she was right. They did respect each other. They were both good pilots. Um, and they both had different paths, right? Nancy did a lot of the test flying and the business side of it. And Jackie was more about the accolades, right? She did air racing. She worked with the prominent airplane developers of the day. So they both had their own path, but they did know each other before the war. And that was one of the things the paperback has more information in the footnotes than the hardcover because I found a piece of data that they did know each other before the war. They both belonged to a club in New York, an aviation club,
Mhm.
and it was a personality clash, right? So it was kind of old money, new money,
Right.
kind of thing. Uh, um, so they had the same mission of getting women to fly and to support the war effort. They had different ideas about it. Nancy thought it should be a smaller, more controlled group. Jackie wanted more people to be able to do it. Um, but they had cooperation. You know, they figured out which of the trainees should go into the ferry command and which shouldn't. The scene that I loved the best, and I got it confirmed. The thing about nonfiction is you can't make anything up, and it's so frustrating sometimes. But everything that's in that book is corroborated by the rule of three, right? I find three different sources that can prove that it really happened. And the story of, Nancy having chicken pox and Jackie helping her with her makeup before they went on for an event. Jackie, of course, had her own makeup company. And that moment of just kindness between two women, I think shows how complicated their relationship was,
Right.
right? That they could
Wow.
have these differing views, these differing personalities, but similar goals, and then have cooperation and kindness. Just shows how complicated women's relationships can be,
Mm.
for sure, especially when they're both ambitious. And that's the thing that drives me nuts about Nancy's story is so many people say, "Oh, Nancy was so classy and so, oh, Nancy, Nancy." And Jackie was tough. It's like Nancy was ambitious and she made things happen and she went through the back door sometimes to get it done. And I think it just often undersells who Nancy Love was. She was very complicated. Um, Jackie was open with her ambition. Nancy was quiet and going in the back door with the same ambition.
I think we've kind of dubbed them two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I feel like because Jackie was so loud about what she wanted, she was just
Mhm.
always very vocal about what she wanted, that sometimes what Nancy was doing kind of took a back seat. But that doesn't
Yeah.
mean that Nancy was doing anything less.
Yeah.
Um, but I do always love that Nancy continued to ferry planes with her girls.
Hmm.
And I think that was one of the things that I kind of said, "Oh, there's more to Nancy than I think sometimes we get when we
Hmm.
research the WASP, because Jackie's name immediately comes
Yeah.
up right away." We were on Winnie,
Yeah.
we were on something last week. We
Yes,
attended
last
an
Wednesday.
event on Zoom last week, and the gentleman that gave the presentation on the WASP his mother was a WASP, and I wish I could remember his name. But he gave a whole presentation and he had 2 slides on Jackie. And he had 2 lines on Nancy, and he dubbed her the other woman in the WASP. And I was like,
Oh, I need to know who that was.
and I immediately texted Winnie and I said, "Did you hear that?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "I don't like that. I
No.
don't like that at all." Because
Mm-mm.
she's not the other woman. She essentially was the first. And then Jackie came back from the ATA
Well, she
to
was blocked from coming
Yeah.
back,
she was
right? I mean, it was a
mhm,
parallel thing, and that's the story of Nancy getting the newspaper headlines first and getting those ferry
mhm,
commands in first. There really was subterfuge. There really was activity behind the scenes of getting signatures on papers while General Arnold was out of town to make it happen. Kind of, there really was trickery,
mhm,
which Jackie always claimed, and I always thought Jackie was paranoid, but she wasn't. There, I found the smoking gun, and Nancy and her allies in the military really did try to force Jackie out, before she even got in. So they really did started at the same time. Jackie was starting the recruiting immediately at the same time as the ferry
mhm.
division. But yeah, you can't call Nancy the other woman and set her aside. No,
Really can't.
they both were needed. They both made it happen. And I like your analogy of the 2 sides of the same coin. I think that's very, very fitting.
I think we also theorized that in some ways that Nancy was um I feel like Nancy was more comfortable and more set in her ways,
Hmm.
whereas I feel like Jackie had to be so outright and bounding into places because she was new money and that could be taken from her at any moment.
Hmm.
I know that she had 2 biographies, and we've had a couple of sources say that a lot of it is not really telling the truth.
Hmm.
Did you find anything that didn't corroborate while you were researching for your book?
Yeah, so Jackie did her Stars at Noon in the 50s. The idea is that Floyd, her husband, actually wrote it. Um,
Oh.
but with her. But there's a really good biography by Doris Rich on Jackie Cochran. I don't know if you guys have found that one. She's an academic. It's
I
published
think I
in
saw that one. I've
yeah,
seen
it's
that one
pub
at the Museum of Flight here in Seattle, and I keep going to buy it, and then I'm like, no, I need to get something else.
yeah.
But I've seen it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Doris is a good academic and found the sources. And then there's a book. I'm looking at my bookshelf here to see if I can see the title. By one of Jackie's nieces called Superwoman or something like that. It's very thin, not quite self-published, but close. And it busts all the myths,
Oh,
right?
okay.
It's a
Okay.
myth buster. It talks about, no, we were her family and she came to see us, and it busts those myths of Jackie's that are in the Stars at Noon. And then
mhm,
Doris Rich's book kind of takes those and delves into divorce records and birth records and things like that. No, Jackie actually had a son, when she was and got married when she was 14, and those kinds of details that Jackie just leaves out of her "I'm running for Congress" book. Um, right?
That is really what it is. Like from
yeah,
reading the first couple of pages when
Yeah,
I've been browsing, I'm like, oh, this isn't this is for something completely different than
yeah,
I am looking for.
yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. And she had a mythology around herself. Some of it she believed, some of it she didn't. But she came from nothing. She was so
Hmm.
poor. And for her to land where she did, even if she hadn't met Floyd, she was doing very well for herself. But then, you know, marrying the richest man in America never hurts your ambitions.
Yeah, it's gonna do good things for you
yeah.
in the
Yeah,
long run, I feel.
Yeah,
yeah,
you're gonna get a boost somewhere. Yes,
You're gonna
absolutely.
get a little kick somewhere.
yeah,
Um, when you came to write about the militarization of these women,
yeah.
sort of realized that Jackie didn't involve herself
Hmm.
in all of that. Was that a case of embarrassment, or was that just poor health due to all the health issues that you also describe?
Yeah, yeah, no, I think so. The fight for militarization starts actually in the 60s, right? Teresa James is starting to write
Yeah.
letters and things like that. And she went to Jackie in the late 60s and early 70s and said, "Hey, I'm doing this. Will you help?" And Jackie said, "If I couldn't make it happen, you're not going to be able to make it happen." So that was part of it was, I had and she was right to think that a little bit because she had all this influence at the time and power, but she didn't I don't think she quite understood the changing politics of the
Mm,
1970s, right?
mm,
72 is when the Equal
yeah.
Rights Amendment
Yeah.
is passed, even though it doesn't get ratified. It changed things. Um, I think her health was definitely an issue. She was dealing with things with Floyd, with herself. Um, and she just didn't have any reason to do it, right? She'd made her way. She didn't think there was any real benefit, and she was never one to tie herself to what she thought was a losing cause.
Mm,
Two, she didn't really think women should be in the military in a non-emergency, right? She actually testified against women
yeah.
being admitted into the Air Force Academy, which the women who I know who went into the Air Force Academy in the 70s can't believe, that this great Jackie Cochran would do that. But
Right.
you know, she I think her ideas shifted over time as she got older and more melancholy.
Sort of made it
I
more
think
difficult
I
for
think they
everyone
were
else, really.
somewhat
Yeah.
consistent as well. Yeah. 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 Jackie was complicated.
She really was. She was a
She was. That's,
difficult woman, would we?
I don't know, not difficult. I think
I
she,
wish I'd known her.
mm,
Oh, yeah.
she seems like the kind of person you would want to sit down with and just ask, right? Just
Yeah.
why, what was your why and what was
Yeah.
you know, your how at all of this, because I get the impression
Yeah.
that she was, at
Yeah.
some point, I get the impression that she was scared because she was new money, right? And new money could be taken from you at any time. And I think she was always the
Yeah.
impression or the vibe I kind of got was that she felt like she needed to continue to claw her way through and claw her way to the top because something could be taken from her. Whereas Nancy was kind of born into money and she lived through the depression and she lived through having to give up her education and she knew what could be taken and how to adjust herself, I think, accordingly. Whereas I think Jackie refused to fall flat on her back again and be that dirt poor. And you can't really blame her in a way for
Right.
wanting to
Right.
continue to push and push and push every door open.
Mhm. Well, and I think it's part of your character, right? Is to I don't know if she was afraid of losing money or not. I don't know. She actually did lose a lot of it, right? They had to downsize a ton
Mm,
towards the end of life, but
right.
I think it was just that desire to be seen and to be respected, right? That kind of, no, I am smart. I am a
Mhm.
great pilot. I am worthy of being respected. And anyone who didn't respect her or show her that kind of um, recognition, she was going to prove it to them, right? That she deserved to be where she was, that she earned it, that she really was that smart and that good. Um, and she was liked by a lot of people. There was a lot of people who didn't like her, but a lot of people really liked her. Um, well respected as a pilot for sure. And I don't know, she was interesting. She was interesting,
For
right?
sure.
Yeah, absolutely she was. Um, I guess kind of going back to the women for a minute, going
Yeah.
going back to the girls. There was a point in their training, in their service, where they were kind of America's sweethearts in a way. Life magazine came and did a whole spread on them. I actually just found a copy of that magazine on eBay, and it was sitting on my front door last night when I got home from work, and I said, "Oh, perfect timing, right?"
Yeah.
Special delivery.
It's an incredible article, and they really were loved by so many. And then all of a sudden, with the beginnings of the not the demilitarization, the disbandment and the announcement of the disbandment of the WASP, America sort of just really turned on their heel and turned their backs on them. Do you find that you think that it's a case of, well, men are coming home now, and now you have to go back to your place is really in the kitchen, your place is in the home? Or was it just that they were afraid to maybe show support, even if they believed they should remain active?
I think so. I think a couple of things. I think you get to see these waves of support for women in World War II. And the WASP are a great example of this, right? Where they get this great publicity, they get the Life magazine spread, which is a phenomenal spread. And it's funny, my initial draft of my book was 300,000 words, and the one you have in your hand is 108,000. So yeah, it was really depressing.
Took a lot out.
Wow.
It was really hard. I'm embarrassed to say that I wrote that much, but then I'm like, oh my God. But there's I've got a whole, multi-page scene about Life magazine coming and taking their pictures and um, the whole experience. But this idea of getting that great publicity, and that encouraged more women to apply, right? Some of the women in the lit kind of things. But that 1944, that fight to get that, make them officially part of the military, which, remember, groups like the Women's Army Corps started as an auxiliary, right? And
Right.
had to be brought in officially. Um, and the the it was a propaganda campaign against them, right? You've got these men who are going to lose their draft deferment, right? Because the Air Force many pilots. So you've got this group of men who've been um, flight instructors, which is a draft deferred position, right? They're doing the initial training of men pilots to go into the Army Air Forces, to go into the Navy. Well, the Air Forces and Navy don't need men. They're going to let those guys go, which means their deferment's gone. Now they can be a part of the Walking Man's Army. Just as we're getting ready for an invasion of France, just as we're getting ready for an invasion of Japan, we think at the time. And so you get this huge effort to discredit the women, to say, why are we letting all these little girls fly these planes? The men should not push against them is where it comes from, right? This congressmen who resent, the women getting to fly these planes, resent the way the paperwork was done in the beginning, um, lack support of it. I mean, it's a hot mess. This fight for veterans to be brought into the military. And it doesn't really fail in the summer of 44, but it fails to move forward, and it's the end of the legislative session. And then the whole, once we liberate Paris, once we're making progress in the war, then this idea of it was never acceptable for women to replace men. You could release men to go and fight in combat. You could release men to go and do these other things, but it was never acceptable for women to replace men. If a man is available for the job, then he needs to have that job. You need to go home. And you'll see this with the factories. You'll see this with everything, right? The immediate post-war jobs, the women are all sent home because the men need the jobs. And so that's the WASP are really one of the first groups of women to be sent home, just like
Right.
Rosie the Riveter will, and 6 months after the WASP are, the women are sent home because enough men are surviving and going to come take those jobs, and they don't need as many doing the jobs that are done. So of course you're going to send the women home, and the American public you know, in December of 1944, they got some publicity. Bob Hope sends letters out saying how great these women were because he had flown with them
Right.
and all of these things. But in reality, they get disbanded in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, right? People aren't paying attention to these, you know, women pilots. Who are these women pilots? I don't care what's going on in Europe, right? What's going on in Japan? You know,
Right.
there's so much going on that they just get forgotten, right? They just get pushed aside. And then, of course, they have to go home in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge when the war is still ongoing and say, we're not needed anymore. You know, it was very emotionally very difficult time because they were really doing something for the war effort, and then they were told they weren't needed anymore. It was embarrassing.
And then they had to make their own way home and pay their own way home and
Oh,
go home and tell their families that I was doing this really amazing thing. And
yeah.
I think, Gabby, we've discussed that they got to a point where they stopped saying they were flying because
They
a lot
just
of,
said they took like defense jobs and that they couldn't speak about it
Right. I
because
think
yeah.
it's
they
so
were
those
and
stories
sad.
get,
It was sad. I
yeah,
wouldn't
those
even say
stories get
embarrassing.
those stories get mixed, right?
Hmm.
So General Arnold said you can take a plane or fly a military plane to as close to your home as possible, right? So all the WASP across the country at all the different 200 and some bases they were at, they could, if there was a military plane going close to their home, they could fly on it close to their home.
Hmm.
But it depended on the base commander whether they got to do it. You know, one of my friends, Shootsy Reynolds, the one who actually made these banners, she you know, she got flown to Las Vegas, and then the guy's like, "Oh, the plane's broken." He wanted to spend time in Vegas, and she had to hoof her way all the way to
Yes.
Pennsylvania. So it was a case by case basis, you know. And some of the women, you know, stayed working for the Army Air Forces as civilians, working in the air traffic control tower, working on the bases. Some went home and didn't tell anybody. It was those
Right.
post-war years when veterans came back, the men came back. It's like, oh yeah, I flew the B-25 too, that they'd be shot down at the parties, you know, and so they just stopped saying what they'd done because nobody wanted to hear the story. And some of them were like, look, these guys flew, you know, combat missions. I'm not going to sit and tell them about how I did, you know, engineering test flights over Tulsa, you know.
Right.
So a lot of them just didn't talk about it. And then you get busy, you know, you have kids, you don't talk about who you were before, you know, or if you're working full time, your coworkers don't care about what you do, you know, what you did 5 years ago, 10 years ago, who you were, what you did. Were you an athlete? Were you whatever? Nobody knows. Nobody asks these questions. And so they just all moved on because they had all done something for the war. So they
Mm.
just stopped talking about it. And it's funny when I met a lot of their kids in the 90s, 1990s, some of them were like, yeah, I didn't know until I was 35 that mom had flown airplanes in World War II. And I didn't, you know, because they just not talked about it.
I think that that was mentioned in we watched a documentary recently with you in it. And I believe it's one of the children or the grandchildren of one of the WASP that says, Mum didn't tell us that she
Yeah,
did this, and we had to find out through, I think he says a YouTube video where they paused. It's like, oh look, there's Mama, because
right.
they just did not talk about it. And I
Mm.
feel awful that these women kept these amazing stories in, even though they felt like maybe their experience paled in comparison to their counterpart, the men, they still did something incredible and so
Yeah.
empowering for, I feel like, our generation, future generations of women to, women can do everything.
Yeah.
Oh,
And I feel like I feel bad that they had to keep that quiet
yeah.
Hmm.
in a way,
Yeah. I just didn't think anyone would care.
which
That
is so
breaks my
sad.
heart. They've
Yeah.
Yeah.
changed. I mean, just reading about them, learning about them, even just the journey that Winnie and I have been on so far. I think I didn't expect any one group to really pull me in and
Mm,
like change my perspective, but it's it's been the WASP. I think hands
Good.
down say
yeah.
that they really have changed the way even today, right? Change the way that I look at things that I think I can't do that. Or,
Yeah.
I'm 36. I can't switch everything in my life now, but I can if I really want
Yeah.
to, right? They did it.
Yeah.
Why can't I just, turn everything around and change
Yeah.
everything if I really wanted to? And I think that it really does make me sad that they felt like they had to just kind of lock that piece of this really important piece of themselves away, because it's worth sharing. And it's almost like, it's not that it's too late, that some of them are, almost all of them, I don't even know if any of the women are still surviving
Just a
today,
handful. Yeah.
just a handful, that it's up until now that these stories are really becoming widely known and more available to people. And I just hope that there's like little girls out there somewhere that would find inspiration the way we found
Yeah.
inspiration as adults, to keep going and keep pushing, and that nothing's really out of your reach.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that. That's so touching, because that's, when I met Carol, my determination was to never walk into another room where they'd never heard of the WASP, right? Because I just think their story is inspiring. And, I had the great fortune to spend the last 30 years with them, right? It's been over 30 years since I met Carol. And I still, Mickey Bright, the woman on the front piece of the book with the full size picture of her, Mickey is still alive. She's 104 almost.
Gosh.
And yeah, she's fantastic, still very sharp.
Wow.
She went on, was a
I love that.
stockbroker after the, first stockbroker in her state kind of thing. Just fantastic. And it's like, people should know about these women, because as you said, it gives you the sense that you really can do something. And that's partly why I wanted to, a third of the book isn't about the war. And that was really controversial. I had different publishers who wanted, you know, it took me a long time to get this book out because I kept adding research to it and stories. And I had one publisher who just wanted, several actually, who just wanted the war years. And I said, no, it's important to get that middle period, that what happens after the war? What happens after you've achieved this great thing and you can't do it anymore? And we all do that, right? When you leave school, or you have a great, I was a soccer player in college. It's like, and then I wasn't anymore. And what do you do, right? Or I talk to a lot of retirement groups, people who are newly retired. It's like, okay, you identified as a teacher your whole life, or as a, whatever, and now you're not anymore. What do you do next? Veterans, they come back, they're out of the military now. What do you do? You have to reinvent yourself. As you said, you're 36 and maybe I want to do something else. You can. And that's partly why I wanted those middle years of the WASP. I could have skipped to just their fight for veterans recognition, but it's like they had to recreate themselves in those middle years, and they weren't allowed to fly military planes anymore. They weren't allowed to be hired for the airlines because they were women.
Right.
And they found other paths. Some were able to keep flying, some weren't. But you can still have a full life, even if you don't get exactly what you want. And if you don't like what you're doing, change. And I think that's the lesson they tell us, in life. And that this is kind of a longitudinal study, a group biography. It's just, they've taught me so much as a human being about how to be in life and how to, think about life. And so I'm really touched to hear that they had that impact on you of, I can do things. And you should. You get this one precious life, and
Yeah.
you do what you will with it. And don't sit at the end and wish, and that's the lesson they've taught me, is to do what you want to do. And there are no rules. There are no have
No,
tos,
absolutely
That's the
not.
beauty of it. There's no
Right.
Yeah.
rules.
right? That's what they show us, right? From the beginning.
Yeah.
No, you can't fly. Well, yes, I can.
Right.
No, you
And I
can't
will.
own your own business. Yes, I can. No, you can't. Yes, I can. Right? That's the life that you aren't veterans. Yes, we were. they fight, and we had to fight to get them into Arlington, and now they're being removed from Department of Defense websites, and so we're going to fight for them to make sure they're not forgotten again, because that's what happens is they're not. There's some films and books out there that say they were classified and top secret, and no, they were their paperwork was all declassified in the 50s. I've got it all with the stamps. They were just forgotten. They weren't hidden.
Yeah.
They weren't, they were forgotten. And that's worse, right?
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
worse, is that they were forgotten. And so I'm really glad you guys have joined the cause to not let
We're
them be
very
forgotten.
we're
Yeah.
very happy to be a part of it, and
Yeah.
we as excited as you could be in a situation like that, we're excited to be along for the fight this time.
Good,
Yeah.
good.
We
Do you
are.
have a favorite WASP story? Ours is the B-29 story that we've mentioned a couple times so far in our previous couple of episodes. Do you have one that you heard from a WASP herself, or do you have one that you heard, through your own research?
Yeah. I think the B-29 story, of course, is the best. And I had the great fortune to know Dora pretty well. And and I knew Paul Tibbets, who was the pilot of the Enola Gay. And so that is a great story. I think one of my favorite stories is Teresa James, who, of course, Teresa and Dink are the
Yeah.
romantic story in the book. All true, but you got it. Teresa was very funny. She was so, I mean, such a personality. And one of my favorite stories is a story she told about flying the P-51, because she usually flew the P-40, which is the Jug, right? It's a big,
Yeah.
heavy,
Yeah.
kind of you manhandle it kind of thing. She had all this time in it. She got out to California and they assigned her a P-51, which is, much more refined, much, and here's this woman who's a great pilot. She'd been a flight instructor before, had all this flight time, all this fairing, and she talks about getting into that P-51 and coming into they said, here, you're going to fly this across the country. She said, I've never flown it. They give her the specs and say, okay, read this and then go take off and land 3 times. And she's, like, okay. So she goes out and she takes off the first time. And then they're in California and the fog rolls in, and she can see the fog coming and knows she has to land the first time or she's gonna not be able to land because of the fog, and comes in and she says, I bounced that thing so far because she came in too fast and it was too light, and she just, this great pilot, and she does all this, terrible landing, and but gets in just as the fog comes in. And then the next morning the fog clears and they say, okay, here's your orders, fly it to Florida. She's like, but I only did one terrible landing. I'm like, you'll figure it out along the way. And here's this P-51. This is a really important to the war, this beautiful, expensive, just rolled off the line plane. And they're sending this woman who's had one bad landing in it to fly across the country. No GPS, no, just, oh, go find your way. And she talked about that as this, she liked her Jug, right? She liked that P-40 that she could fly, but that P-51, she just would talk about it and use her hands when she talked about it. And just the things they let, they had to have these pilots do, and there were men doing the same kind of flying. They just needed that plane gone so bad they couldn't even give her the time or the gas to practice landing a little bit more before she set off on this big cross country. So I think Teresa's stories are always among my favorite, stops when she had to go to the bathroom and, I mean, just all sorts of, a big hangar full of men and her having to find, you know, I don't know. She was funny. She was very funny. So, and a lot of her stories got cut. So many stories got cut. It's so sad.
Can we have the full version, please? The first
Oh
draft.
yeah,
Can
yeah.
we
It
can
was
we
a
have
hot
the whole
mess.
thing? Thanks.
I will miss every stop I have to make to work and back just to read
You would.
just to read the
You
whole
would.
thing.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah, I
my
cut whole
gosh.
people. I've got a whole file thing here where I I had to have these kind of lead characters. You follow Teresa all the way through, you follow Dora all the way through,
Right.
and I had more that were I knew all these women, all the leads that are in the book other than Nancy and Jackie, I knew. And so I have their whole story. So I had whole people, Shootsy and Dawn Seymour and others that were woven through. But it took a little too much away from the main stories. I could weave in their story. So they're both in the book, but just not in support roles more than the whole
Right.
thing. And the pictures are all people I knew. The photos I picked that I couldn't
Yeah.
include, So Jan Goodrum's in there with her little college
Mhm.
sweater and different things like that because I had to get him in there somehow. I don't know. It
You
was,
can absolutely tell that you knew these women personally. The way
Yes.
that you write about
Mhm.
them with so
Yeah,
much love and respect, you can tell that you
yeah.
had a very good friendship with all of them.
Well, I
And
appreciate
it
that.
translates so well. I think that's why we got so sucked in and why we feel like, that we're friends with them at this point
Yeah.
because we read that through you.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a heavy weight to be trusted to tell a story well.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
You
I
know.
feel like we've felt some of a tiny bit of that way when we were given the chance to talk about Josie Pitts
Yeah.
for our first WASP episode. We felt very, oh my goodness, we're being given all of this access and information to talk
Yeah.
about
The
this wonderful
nerves,
woman.
the nerves I felt dialing the phone just to talk to her daughter.
Yeah.
Oh my God. I mean, and she was just so kind and she spoke of
Oh,
her mom. I think she was a little surprised that we wanted to speak about her mom. We wanted to talk about her
yeah.
mom because I think most people reach out to her to talk about her dad.
Yeah. Especially
Most,
since Masters of the Air has
especially
come
since
out. And
Masters of the
yeah.
Air, most people want to know about John Egan, but and we say this all the time that we didn't know who Josie was. We didn't know who the Wasp was until the very end credits of Masters of the Air. And they showed that photo
Wow.
of John and Josie. And I said, oh, wow, his wife was a Wasp. And I Googled it real quick and I said, oh, she flew planes. And we kind of put it aside and said, we'll get there. We
Yeah.
will absolutely get there. And I didn't realize that when we got there, what we were going to find and what we were going to, open up and discover. And it's been amazing.
Oh, I'm
She
so
said,
glad.
she's my mom, I tell people all the time, my mom flew fighters and my dad flew bombers,
Yeah.
which
Right.
is very accurate.
Yeah. Yeah. And the men, John Luckadoo is a friend of mine, and he, and the other men really respected her so much and wanted to make sure her story
Wonderful.
was told and not forgotten as
I
well.
love that.
Good.
Yeah.
Love that.
And I'm glad we get to be a part of,
Yes.
expanding everyone's knowledge on her a little bit, just so
Yeah.
she's not just John's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Was there
absolutely.
was there anything else about World War II history that sort of sparked your passion, or has it always and will always be WASP? Would there be anything else you would write a book about, maybe?
Yeah, so I obviously the WASP are the core, in part because I knew them and spent so long with them. But there's so many other groups. I study war and society, so the men of the 100th, I know their story and all of that well. But I think the women flight nurses, there were um nurses that were nurses, but then they would get in the planes,
Mhm.
especially they did this in the Pacific, but also in Europe, and they would, get in unmarked planes, not with a Red Cross or anything, because they would be filled with ammunition and fuel or whatever, and they would fly as close to combat as they could and drop off the supplies, and then they would drop down uh, uh, stretchers and have wounded put on and then fly them out. And the nurses would be, have a medical tech in the back with them, but they would be it as they flew out. Some were shot down, some crashed, and they didn't get combat pay or anything like that. So they were really, and they all volunteered.
Yeah.
You had to volunteer to be a flight nurse. So that's a group that I've been doing some more research on as kind of a next project. It's hard because I've been so spoiled my whole professional career as a historian because I could just, when I wrote the scene of Dora giving testimony before Congress to get that veterans right, I just called Dora and said, "Hey,
Yeah.
what'd you wear that day? And how did it feel?" And, she's like, "Oh, it was so lonely because they were all in the back." And it's like, you can't get that unless they've written about it somewhere.
Yeah.
So I feel very, it's an adjustment to try to do this without that little cheat,
Yeah.
right? It's a cheat as a historian.
Yeah.
And it's sad because we're slowly losing more and more of these
Yeah.
incredible people.
Mhm.
And I think that's why it's important that, we keep telling their stories, not
Mm.
just we in general, but as a society, we keep
Yeah.
telling their stories. Because until you stop saying their name, I don't truly ever believe that they are gone from
Yeah.
history.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I'm, when I give talks, I always end the talk, the WASP, they gave me the responsibility. They trusted me to tell their story after they were gone. And now, everyone listening, everyone in the room is a part of that. We owe that to them to share their story and
Right.
not let them be forgotten again.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Absolutely agree. Kate, where can we find you and what are you up to next?
I'm actually just keeping on, right? And doing more documentaries and looking at different things. And I'm actually going to Denver next week to the Women in Aviation Conference. You guys should think about attending that sometime. Maybe setting up a podcast episode there or something. And there's
We
a
would
group
love
of
to.
women
That would be
they're not
amazing.
World War II, but they're those women who flew in the 70s and 80s. We call them Gen 2, is the second generation after the
Yeah.
WASP. And I'm starting to gather their oral histories now. They're all in their 60s, some are in their 70s, but they've got some really interesting stories to tell of learning to fly and fighting for the opportunities, not during war, in
Mhm.
post-Vietnam era, and really breaking down barriers both in the military aviation and the airlines. So those are the oral histories I'm gathering now. So we'll see. I do too many
Wonderful.
things at once, so that's why it takes so long,
Same.
Guilty.
right?
Very
Also
guilty.
us.
Right. But it's important and it keeps life interesting, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Boring life,
Yes,
right?
Absolutely
absolutely.
does.
Right?
Yes.
Boring women have clean houses, right? I don't know. That's my
Correct.
philosophy,
Yeah.
right? That's my philosophy.
That
It's
makes
like,
me feel better.
That makes, oh God, that makes me feel
Thanks.
so much better.
yeah, I don't know.
Thank you.
Right? We could fill our house with cleanness, or we can fill it with, our joy.
Knowledge, love.
That's right.
Adventure. Yeah,
That's right.
Exactly.
absolutely.
Well,
Thank
good.
you, Kate. This
Thank
has
you so
been
Absolutely.
much.
amazing.
Absolutely.
Such an honor. Thank you for writing a wonderful book and thank you for being willing to speak with
Oh,
us.
Yes, thank you for
this is so
sharing your time with
special.
us. This has been wonderful.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for reading it, and thanks for all the nice things. It was a long and hard journey, and it's nice to know that it means something to somebody. So I appreciate it.
Of
Oh,
course.
absolutely.
Thank you, Kate.
All right.
Thank
Well, thanks
you.
so much. Keep in touch, okay?
We
Will
will.
do. Thank
Okay,
you.
bye-bye.
Thank you.